They ruled the stars with a confidence born from countless victories, moving from system to system like storms sweeping across plains, leaving nothing but silence in their wake. The Predator Confederacy was not a government, nor a culture in the sense most civilizations understood. It was a pact among hunters, an alliance of apex species who had risen above all rivals and carved dominance into the fabric of the galaxy. Their traditions were written not in words but in blood. Trophies of bone and metal hung in their halls, reminders of prey that had dared resist and had been annihilated. To them, fear was not simply a tool, it was currency, weapon, and shield. Civilizations that bent the knee were allowed to live as livestock, producing tribute. Those who defied were crushed so thoroughly their stars themselves seemed to dim. From their earliest origins, these predators had been sculpted by competition so savage that cooperation was alien to their instincts. Yet mutual recognition of strength bound them together. The Confederacy was formed when their leaders realized no prey remained to challenge them separately. Together, they could carve the galaxy into hunting grounds. Their fleets were monuments to this philosophy, warships shaped like predators from their homeworlds, bristling with weapons designed not merely to destroy, but to terrify. They wanted their victims to see death coming, to know who held power before the end arrived. Every story carried across the stars spoke of their inevitability. Worlds that resisted for centuries were crushed within days. Empires that claimed superiority were stripped of sovereignty, their rulers hunted for sport. The Confederacy fed on fear as much as resources, and their legend grew with each conquest. No coalition of prey races ever lasted long against them. Attempts at resistance collapsed the moment the predators demonstrated what they could do to one world as an example to the rest. Entire populations were enslaved or erased to make a statement, none may stand against the apex. Among the galaxy's countless species, fear of the Confederacy became an instinct. The mere arrival of their ships in orbit triggered surrender before a single shot was fired. Generations grew up with their presence looming like a shadow, entire cultures reshaped by the need to appease their overlords. Some races even worshipped them, seeing in the predators a kind of divine order, survival of the fittest manifest in flesh and steel. Others whispered rebellions in secret, but these sparks were always extinguished. No prey had the endurance to match them. For the predators themselves, dominance was not questioned. Victory was routine, and the idea of failure absurd. They looked upon the galaxy with the disdain of hunters gazing across a field of docile animals. Their confidence was so complete that they did not even consider the possibility of equals. To them, the hierarchy of existence was immutable, predator above prey, hunter above hunted. The Confederacy embodied that truth, a council of killers united in purpose, to remind the galaxy of its place. It was not arrogance born of ignorance, but arrogance forged by experience. They had faced countless wars and had always emerged triumphant. Weapons designed to frighten, strategies perfected over millennia, fleets larger than some civilizations' populations, all were theirs to command. Their society celebrated the hunt at every level, from ritual duels among their young to campaigns that spanned light years. A predator's worth was measured by the number of kills, the ferocity of their victories, and the fear they instilled in others. And yet, for all their might, there was a complacency woven into their supremacy. When no rival can strike fear into you, vigilance begins to fade. They did not notice the subtle erosion of their edge, the way certainty blinded them to possibilities beyond their traditions. In their minds, the galaxy had been mapped, prey catalogued, threats neutralized. What remained was expansion, feeding, sustaining the myth of their invulnerability. When whispers reached them of a new world on the edge of explored space, a world filled with an ambitious young species, it stirred little more than curiosity. Another hunt, another opportunity to display dominance. Reports described a primitive civilization compared to their own, bound to a single planet, still fumbling with fledgling fleets. Such beings were beneath concern. The Confederacy prepared as they always did, fleet movements, intimidation broadcasts, careful orchestration of fear before the killing began. There was no anticipation of challenge, only the satisfaction of a familiar cycle. This certainty was their truth. They were the hunters, and the galaxy was their prey. Nothing had ever defied that order. They could not yet imagine that beyond that insignificant blue world, behind the eyes of the beings they dismissed, lay something they had never encountered. Something that would shatter their certainty, burn their legends, and redefine the very meaning of fear. When the scouts of the Confederacy first detected transmissions from the small blue planet, their initial reports were colored with disdain. To their eyes, humanity's technology was crude, their fleets few, their weapons primitive. It was the sort of prey world they had conquered countless times before, a species still bound by atmosphere and gravity, unaware of the scale of life beyond its skies. The Predators catalogued Earth's radio chatter, mapped its orbital satellites, and observed its patterns with cold amusement. They saw nations divided, cultures fragmented, conflicts simmering across continents, and concluded this would be no more than an entertaining cull. From the Predator's perspective, the story had already been written. They would descend in terrifying vessels, project images of overwhelming might, and issue ultimatums of submission. The humans, they assumed, would squabble briefly among themselves before collapsing under the weight of dread. It was the same pattern repeated across centuries: intimidation, surrender, harvest. To them, the process was inevitable. What they could not comprehend was how a species like humanity could react to such a display, not with paralysis, but with defiance. The first attempts at intimidation broadcast into Earth's skies were not met with silence. Instead, governments scrambled to interpret the signals, and in a rare moment of unity, chose to respond. Rather than falling to their knees, humanity began to calculate. Leaders who once saw each other as rivals convened in urgency. Scientists translated alien threats into grim warnings, and militaries prepared as if the survival of the species hung on the balance, which it did. The Predators had expected panic. What they encountered instead was rapid consolidation, a collective instinct to fight even when the odds mocked them. The Confederacy sent small raiding parties to test human defenses, expecting easy victories that would break morale. Yet what they found were opponents who refused to cower. Jets armed with missiles flung themselves at vessels vastly superior in design, pilots willing to die if it meant inflicting even minor damage. Naval ships engaged targets in orbit with weapons designed for terrestrial war, their crews knowing the futility but pressing forward regardless. When those ships were destroyed, survivors swam in burning seas rather than surrender, some carrying weapons to strike at whatever predator descended upon them. Such behavior defied everything the Confederacy understood about prey. Fear was supposed to paralyze, not ignite fury. Even more troubling were the patterns that began to emerge after these first clashes. Humanity did not react randomly, they adapted. They studied every engagement, dissected weaknesses, and applied new tactics within days. Losses did not break their will but sharpened it. Where the Confederacy expected collapse, they encountered stubbornness that hardened with every strike. Each destroyed city became a rallying point rather than a grave marker. Each death was translated into resolve. For predators who had long relied on psychological dominance, it was disorienting to face a species that transformed suffering into fuel. The Confederacy's arrogance blinded them to the significance of what they were witnessing. They still dismissed Earth as a curiosity, albeit a strangely obstinate one. They underestimated the scale of unity forming among humans, the speed at which technology was being redirected toward war, and the sheer determination that drove them. They measured strength in terms of fleets and firepower, failing to recognize that humanity's greatest weapon was either. It was willpower, unyielding, irrational, terrifying in its persistence. The predators did not yet recognize the danger, but subtle unease began to ripple through their ranks. Reports described humans fighting to the last in hopeless battles, civilians arming themselves when soldiers fell, leaders refusing to negotiate surrender terms. For the first time in generations, the Confederacy's warriors found their intimidation faltering. They had dealt with countless prey before, but none had stared into the maw of extinction and responded by sharpening their teeth. From orbit, Earth seemed small, fragile, and insignificant compared to the empires that had already bowed to the Confederacy. Yet beneath its atmosphere lived a force unlike anything the predators had ever confronted. Humanity had not chosen this war, but they were learning quickly that survival required transformation. The first sparks of resistance had already begun to kindle into a fire the predators would not know how to extinguish. They had assumed Earth would be another trophy in their collection. Instead, they had awoken a species that could not be broken by fear, and in doing so, had set themselves on a path toward a reckoning they could not yet imagine. The early clashes that the predators had expected to be little more than demonstrations of dominance began instead to leave scars on their confidence. They were masters of psychological warfare, accustomed to prey scattering after the first strike, but humanity responded with defiance that made no sense to them. When fleets descended expecting terror, they were met with traps hidden in orbit, volleys of missiles fired from improvised launchers, and ships that struck with suicidal precision. The predators began to realize they were not hunting docile creatures. They were facing opponents who treated every battle as if extinction itself stood behind them. The Confederacy's strength had always rested on fear. Their presence alone had been enough to compel surrender from dozens of species. Yet with humans, intimidation fell flat. Broadcasts meant to crush morale were intercepted, analyzed, and answered with challenges. Images of burning cities did not break the human spirit but hardened it. Even in defeat, humans spoke of retaliation, of debts to be repaid in full. The predators had no experience with prey that grew more dangerous under pressure, prey that did not merely endure suffering but turned it into a weapon. Rumors began circulating within predator ranks. Reports from commanders spoke of humans launching raids even when outnumbered, ambushing superior fleets in asteroid fields, or sacrificing entire squadrons to cripple a single capital ship. Such actions were incomprehensible. The Confederacy had long believed that fear governed survival, that no prey would willingly embrace annihilation if it could be avoided. Humanity shattered that assumption with every engagement. Losses did not diminish them. Instead, they adapted, improved, and struck back with greater ferocity. Psychological cracks began to show among the hunters. Crews that once boasted of their kills now spoke in hushed tones of the humans' refusal to die quietly. Veterans who had crushed a dozen civilizations admitted unease at fighting a species that seemed to thrive on desperation. For the first time in centuries, whispers of caution infiltrated the Confederacy's war councils. They still believed in their superiority, but there was an edge of doubt, a recognition that humanity was rewriting the rules of conflict. The predator's advantage had always been control of fear. Yet humans were proving immune to it in the way prey should not be. Soldiers marched even when annihilation loomed. Civilians turned themselves into militias, striking with crude weapons against advanced warriors. Where other species had cowered, humanity chose to resist. That choice spread like a contagion, infecting every battle with unpredictability. The predators could crush a city, yet the survivors would regroup and strike again. They could massacre armies, yet the remnants would not scatter but regroup into guerrilla forces that harassed them endlessly. The Confederacy began to realize that this defiance was not an anomaly of leadership or circumstance. It was woven into the very nature of humanity. The refusal to yield was instinct, as natural as breathing. Where predators had assumed their place at the top of the food chain was secure, they now faced creatures who fought not for dominance but for survival, and that distinction made them more terrifying than any rival empire. Humans did not seek trophies. They sought vengeance and protection for their own, and in doing so, unleashed a level of ferocity the predators had never anticipated. Commanders who once mocked human tactics grew cautious. They described them as unpredictable, reckless, and irrational, but beneath those words lay a quiet admission: humanity was dangerous precisely because of those traits. They did not adhere to the logic of prey. They would burn their own ships if it meant taking enemies with them. They would march into impossible odds without hesitation. And each time, they found ways to turn those risks into victories, however costly. The Confederacy had built its power on the assumption that nothing in the galaxy could resist fear. Humanity forced them to confront the possibility that true fear was now theirs to bear. For the first time in generations, the predators hesitated before battle, haunted by the knowledge that these strange beings from Earth did not break when struck. They only grew sharper. What had begun as a campaign of conquest was evolving into a lesson, one the Confederacy had never expected to learn. fear was no longer a weapon they alone commanded. Humanity's answer to escalating threats was not despair but transformation. What began as fragmented governments uniting under necessity evolved into a singular focus that startled even themselves. Factories once dedicated to consumer goods roared with new life, repurposed into war foundries. Assembly lines that once built vehicles now produced armored carriers and orbit-capable drones. Nations that had competed for resources redirected everything toward a singular objective: survival through overwhelming resistance. Where the predators expected disorganization, they instead confronted industrial mobilization on a scale they had not foreseen. Fleets began to rise from Earth's surface, hulking vessels lacking the elegance of Confederacy warcraft, but brutal in efficiency. Human designs were pragmatic, emphasizing durability and firepower over intimidation. Every ship was engineered to take damage and keep fighting, to endure punishment that should have crippled them. Predators were accustomed to battles ending swiftly when their first strikes shattered enemy morale. Against humans, those expectations dissolved. A battered fleet returned fire with unrelenting ferocity, pressing the assault until predator formations broke apart. The Confederacy attempted to adapt, deploying larger forces and coordinated assaults to overwhelm the stubborn defenders. Yet the more pressure they applied, the more inventive humanity became. Captured technology was dissected, reverse-engineered, and repurposed within months. Alien weapons were stripped and refitted onto human frames, producing hybrid war machines that merged practicality with unexpected lethality. Every engagement became an education, every setback a step toward greater capability. Unlike species that crumbled under invasion, humans thrived in adversity, sharpening their claws on the very weapons meant to annihilate them. Predator commanders soon discovered that humanity's tactics defied prediction. Battles were no longer fought according to established patterns. Ambushes erupted from debris fields, minefields appeared in orbital lanes, and suicide charges crippled ships vital to Confederacy offensives. No sacrifice was too great if it secured even a marginal victory. The predators realized with growing alarm that these sacrifices were not mindless. They were deliberate, coordinated, and effective. Humanity was rewriting the art of war in real time, and the Confederacy found themselves unprepared to counter it. As campaigns stretched on, predator losses mounted in ways that could not be ignored. Entire armadas sent to pacify Earth failed to return intact. Colonies once considered secure became vulnerable as human forces launched retaliatory strikes. The psychological tide shifted. Where once prey had looked to the predators with dread, whispers spread across the galaxy of the species that resisted. Refugees and enslaved races began to murmur of Earth's defiance, daring to hope that the Confederacy's reign might not be eternal. The predators, long accustomed to projecting fear outward, now found it reflected back upon themselves. Inside their councils, unease deepened. Numbers painted a grim picture, losses increasing, resources stretched, morale shaken. Veterans who had once sneered at the thought of prey resistance now spoke cautiously of human tenacity. Some demanded escalation to genocidal levels, but even such calls betrayed desperation. To eradicate humanity outright meant acknowledging that they were dangerous, a truth the Confederacy had never wished to face. The very act of considering extermination revealed fear they had never admitted to any foe. Meanwhile, humanity only grew stronger. With each battle, they gained territory, salvaged resources, and inspired their people to greater determination. Defeat was not part of their vocabulary. Every strike against them forged a harder response. Where predators once saw prey, they now recognized something entirely different: a force unwilling to accept subjugation, a species that embodied the very principle of predation turned inward and unleashed outward. Humanity had become not just survivors, but aggressors, hunters of the hunters. The Confederacy's arrogance, the bedrock of their supremacy, began to crack. They had believed themselves untouchable, but now they faced a truth impossible to dismiss. The humans were not merely resilient, they were relentless, adaptable, and merciless when provoked. Predator fleets that had once roamed the galaxy uncontested now withdrew to regroup, fearing what traps awaited them. Leaders who once celebrated conquest now calculated losses and whispered doubts in private. The Confederacy, built upon centuries of unchallenged dominance, was discovering that their greatest nightmare had taken shape in the very species they had dismissed as insignificant. The Confederacy's empire, once a monolith of intimidation, now found itself cornered by a reality it could no longer deny. The hunters had become hunted, and the galaxy was watching. The same voices that once praised predator dominance now whispered with awe and fear of the humans who had risen from obscurity. The predator's enemies, long cowed into silence, began to stir. Rumors spread of an unstoppable Terran fleet, of soldiers who fought without hesitation, and of leaders who demanded no tribute but freedom. The myth of predator supremacy, which had endured for centuries, unraveled under the weight of undeniable defeat. Human fleets expanded outward, no longer bound to their homeworld. They swept into systems once thought secure, striking with precision and certainty. Their ships were not beautiful in design, but they were terrifying in presence, armored titans that pressed forward regardless of losses, armed with weapons adapted from every foe they encountered. Each campaign revealed not only superior endurance but a resolve that unnerved even seasoned predator veterans. Humanity did not fight for conquest, nor for glory. They fought because they refused to be prey, and that purpose gave them a ferocity no predator could match. In desperation, the Confederacy sought negotiation. Envoys were dispatched, their words carrying tones of veiled authority, but humans answered with cold clarity. They reminded the predators that it was the Confederacy who had chosen this war, who had underestimated a species that wanted only to be left alone. There would be no return to the old hierarchy. The predators had demanded obedience, and received resistance. They had unleashed terror, and awakened something far worse. The humans made it clear, there would be no compromise that left the Confederacy intact as it had once been. Fear, once the predators' weapon, was now their burden. Among predator worlds, panic spread faster than fleets could travel. Colonies abandoned by retreating forces faced uprisings from those who no longer accepted subjugation. Allies began to fracture, questioning whether continued loyalty was worth the inevitable cost. The Confederacy had relied on reputation as much as strength, but with every human victory, that reputation rotted. Entire species once enslaved now looked to Earth as proof that resistance was not only possible but winnable. What had begun as a single conflict was spiraling into a galaxy-wide shift of power. For humanity, the transformation was profound. They had not sought empire, but war had forged them into something greater than any predator could have foreseen. They learned to fight not only for themselves but for every voice silenced under Confederacy rule. Their soldiers carried the weight of vengeance, their fleets bore the determination of survival, and their leaders spoke with an authority born from sacrifice. They became the apex not by choice, but by necessity, and in doing so, they claimed a mantle the predators had thought eternal. When the final decisive campaigns broke the Confederacy's fleets, the surviving predators faced truths that stripped them of all arrogance. They saw in humanity not another rival, but a mirror turned against them, a species willing to do what predators had always done, but with a scale and determination that dwarfed anything they had imagined. Humans were not predators in the traditional sense. They were something new, predators of predators, a force that hunted those who once believed themselves untouchable. The galaxy would remember the Confederacy as the apex of fear, but history was now rewritten. From the ashes of their dominance rose a warning etched into the memory of every surviving species. Humans did not desire conquest, but when threatened, they revealed why they must never be underestimated. They carried within them the will to endure any loss, to rise from any defeat, and to turn suffering into strength. That quality made them the most dangerous species the stars had ever known. In the end, the Confederacy's legacy was not their victories, but their mistake in underestimating Earth. What began as a routine hunt had become their downfall, and the lesson echoed across worlds. Humanity did not need to be feared to survive, but once provoked, they became fear itself. From that moment forward, no civilization looked at the blue planet as insignificant again. Its people had proven that when the hunters came, they did not cower. They became the storm that ended the age of predators forever.